your presence. We're here to receive the estimates, the GDP estimates for quarter 4 of 2025, a monthly indicator of economic growth for December 2025, and the annual GDP estimates for the year 2025. To do the presentation is the government statistician, Dr. Alhassan Idrisu.
Recording in
as
progress.
always, please, we ask that you mute your phones to reduce the interaction. Thank you
All right.
very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Francis Bright Mensah. Good morning, distinguished colleagues, members of the media, policymakers, representatives from the business community, the academia, development partners, civil society organizations, and the general public. Today, the Ghana Statistical Service presents the 2025 fourth quarter gross domestic product estimates, the December 2025 monthly indicator of economic growth, and the 2025 annual GDP estimates. These statistics help us understand how Ghana's economy is performing, where growth is coming from, and where policy and investment attention may be required. GDP statistics, as we know, are important because they guide government policy and budgeting. They also inform business decisions, and we also know that they influence investor confidence and shape economic outlook for households and communities. In this presentation, we'll explain key results, the drivers of growth, and what these numbers mean for Ghana's economic development. Before discussing the key results, let me briefly explain a few important economic concepts. Nominal GDP measures the total value of goods and services produced in Ghana using current market prices. However, as we know, prices change over time due to inflation. To account for this, we calculate what we refer to as a real GDP, which adjusts for inflation so that we can measure the actual volume of economic production. The real GDP growth rate tells us how much the economy is expanding or contracting in real terms. We also use two very important concepts. The first is contribution to growth, which shows how much each sector contributes to overall GDP growth. The second is GDP shares, which shows how large each sector is within an economy. In fact, another important indicator is GDP per capita. When GDP is shared among the population, we obtain what we refer to as GDP per capita, which gives an indication of the average income level per person. For now, with regards to the method of estimating GDP, Ghana does it using two approaches. We use what we refer to as a production approach, where we measure GDP from the agricultural sector, industry sector, and services sector perspectives. And then we also measure it from the expenditure approach, where we measure it from the various expenditure sources, including consumption expenditures, investment expenditures, and net exports, which looks at the total spending in the economy. Let me now present the headline results for the 2025 quarter 4. So I want us to begin with the 2025 quarter 4 GDP. The nominal GDP for quarter 4 of 2025 was 377.4 billion Ghana cedis, compared with 331.7 billion Ghana cedis in the same quarter of 2024. In real terms, GDP increased from 53.3 billion Ghana cedis in quarter 4 of 2024 to 56.4 billion Ghana cedis in quarter 4 of 2025. This means that the economy grew by 5.8% year-on-year in the fourth quarter of 2025, compared with 4% in the same period in 2024. This improvement indicates stronger economic momentum toward the end of the year. The non-oil economy grew even faster, recording 7.1% growth, compared with 4.8% in the fourth quarter of 2024. This suggests that growth in the quarter was broadly supported by economic activities outside the oil sector. Ladies and gentlemen, let's look at sectoral GDP performance in the fourth quarter of 2025. And here we are looking at GDP performance from the perspective of the three sectors that we are already aware of, which is agriculture, industry, and services. Agriculture recorded a real GDP growth of 5.3% in the fourth quarter of 2025, up from 3.2% in the same period of 2024. The sector contributed 21% to overall GDP growth and accounted for 20% of total GDP. Growth in agriculture was mainly driven by crops subsector, including cocoa, which returned to positive growth during the quarter. Industry grew by 1.9% in quarter 4 of 2025, compared with 0.3% growth in quarter 4 of 2024. Industry contributed 9.4% to overall GDP growth and accounted for 29.6% of GDP. However, industrial performance was largely affected by a significant contraction in oil and gas production, which declined by 15.6% during the period. Despite this, positive growth was recorded in manufacturing and electricity, which helped support industrial output. Let's now turn to the services sector. The services sector remained the main engine of the economy in the fourth quarter of 2025. The sector expanded by 8.6% in quarter 4 of 2025, compared with 6.9% in quarter 4 of 2024. The sector contributed 63.4% to total GDP growth and accounted for 50.6% of Ghana's GDP. This means that more than half of Ghana's economic output comes from the services sector. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now look at the top 5 expanding subsectors in the fourth quarter of 2024, as well as the bottom 5 contracting subsectors. Among the expanding activities, the fastest growing subsector was information and communication, which recorded real GDP growth of 28.3%. This reflects continued expansion in digital services, telecommunications, and data-related activities, making it one of the strongest contributors to growth within the services sector. The second fastest growing activity was public administration, defense, and social security, which expanded by 11.8%, followed closely by education, which expanded by 11.3%. These activities reflect increased service delivery and public sector activity during the fourth quarter of 2025. Transport and storage also recorded strong growth of 10.6%, reflecting increased movement of goods and services across the economy. Finally, electricity expanded by 7.2%, supporting production activities across several sectors of the economy. Together, these 5 expanding subsectors contributed 61.8% to the overall growth in quarter 4 of 2025 and represent some of the most dynamic areas of economic expansion in the period, particularly within the services sector. But ladies and gentlemen, at the same time, we witnessed some subsectors recording contractions, meaning that they recorded negative growth rates. The largest decline was recorded in forestry and logging, which contracted by 10.4%, reflecting continued challenges in the subsector. Accommodation and food service activities also contracted by 4.5%, while water supply, sewerage, and waste management contracted by 4%. In addition, real estate contracted by 2%, and we had other personal services which also contracted by 2%. Now, altogether, these 5 activities dragged growth down by 3.9% in Q4 of 2025. Although these subsectors present a smaller share of total economic activity, their declines indicate areas where economic performance remained weak during the quarter. Overall, the strong growth in information and communication, in transportation, in education, as well as in public administration, helped offset the effect of the contracting subsectors, supporting the overall growth of 5.8% recorded in the fourth quarter of 2025. I must add that oil and gas production also continued to decline, which limited overall industrial growth. Let us now turn to the provisional growth estimates for December 2025 using the monthly indicator of economic growth. The monthly indicator of economic growth, or what we refer to as MIEG, provides early signals of economic activity before the full quarterly GDP figures are released. As you may recall, we had presented the November figures in our previous release. Today we have the opportunity to look at how December fared. The monthly index of economic growth for December 2025 was 123.9, compared with 112.5 in December 2024, representing a year-on-year growth of 10.1%. That's for December 2025. Looking at the months within the fourth quarter, economic activity as measured by the monthly indicator of economic growth grew by 4.5% in October, 2.7% in November, and 10.1% in December 2025. This shows a clear acceleration in economic activity towards the end of the quarter. Services led the December expansion with 12.9% growth, followed by agriculture at 5.7% and industry at 4.3%. These results reinforce the stronger GDP growth recorded in the fourth quarter of 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now turn to the provisional 2025 annual GDP. That if you put all of these together, that's the quarterly growth performance, the monthly growth performance, and we put all of it together for 2025, what was the key results? The nominal GDP for 2025 reached 1.434 trillion on provisional basis, compared with 1.183 trillion in 2024. In real terms, that is, if you take away the effect of inflation, GDP increased from 197.9 billion Ghana cedis in 2024 to 209.6 billion Ghana cedis in 2025. This represents real GDP growth of 6% in 2025, slightly higher than the 5.8% recorded in 2024. The non-oil economy grew even faster, recording 7.6% growth in 2025. Now, let us look at the sectoral performance for the full year. Agriculture grew strongly by 6.8% in 2025, up from 2.7% in 2024, supported mainly by crops, fishing, and a recovery in cocoa production. The sector contributed 23.7% to overall growth and constituted 22.8% of the economy. Industry grew by 2.3% in 2025, down from 7.2% in 2024, reflecting declines in oil and gas activities. The sector contributed 12.4% to overall growth and accounted for 31.3% of the economy. Services expanded by 8.1% in 2025, up from 6.2% in 2024, making it the fastest growing sector. The sector contributed 58.2% to the overall economic growth and accounted for 45.9% of the economy. Whilst the growth rate of both the agriculture and services sectors in 2025 were higher than the average growth rate for the period 2014 to 2025, that for industry was lower in 2025 compared to the average growth in the period 2014 to 2025, largely on account of the poor performance of the oil and gas sector, subsector. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the contracting and expanding subsectors in 2025. Let me highlight the subsectors that drove expansion and those that experienced the contraction in the year 2025. Among the expanding activities, the fastest growing subsector was information and communication, which actually recorded a real GDP growth of 20.2%. And here, I'm dealing with the first box. This strong expansion reflects continued growth in telecommunications, digital services, and data-related activities, making it one of the most dynamic areas of Ghana's economy. The second fastest growing activity was education, which expanded by 11.6%, indicating increased demand for education services and expanded service delivery during the year. Fishing also recorded a strong growth of 9.5%, contributing positively to the overall performance of the agriculture sector. In the services sector, transport and storage grew by 8.6%, reflecting increased movement of goods across the economy. In addition, we had financial and insurance activities, which expanded by 6.8%, highlighting continued activity in banking, insurance, and financial intermediation. Now, if you put these top 5 expanding subsectors together, they together contributed 47.2% to the overall growth of 6% in 2025. At the same time, we saw some subsectors recording contractions during the year. Again, contraction means that those subsectors recorded negative growth rates. What are these subsectors? The largest decline occurred in other personal services, which contracted by 2.8%. Forestry and logging also declined by 2.4%. In other words, it contracted by 2.4%, reflecting continued structural challenges in the sector. Within industry, mining and quarrying contracted by 0.9%, mainly due to the weaknesses in oil production during the year. In the services sector, real estate recorded a decline of 0.5%, while water supply, sewage and waste contracted by 0.3%. Now, if you put all of these contracting subsectors together, they pulled growth down by 3%. Although these contracting subsectors represent a smaller share of total economic activity, their declines highlight areas where economic performance remained subdued in 2025. But I must say that overall, the strong growth in information and communication, education, fishing, transport and storage, and financial services helped sustain Ghana's economic expansion in 2025, despite the contractions in some subsectors. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us now look at the top 5 drivers of growth in 2025. In other words, or in simple language, what drove Ghana's economic growth in 2025? We should all note that by drivers of growth, we are not only looking at the growth rates of activities. In other words, we are not looking at only the activities that saw the biggest expansion, but we are also looking at their what? Their relative weights. So if you combine both the growth rates and then the weights together, that's where we talk about the drivers of growth. And the technical term we use there is contribution. The data show that 5 key activities, namely information and communication, and I'm dealing with the third box, crops, gold, manufacturing, and transport and storage, together accounted for 79.1% of total GDP growth in 2025. This indicates that the bulk of economic expansion came from a relatively small group of high-performing sectors. The largest contributor to growth was information and communication, which contributed 23.7% to total GDP growth in 2025 and recorded a real growth rate of 20.2%. This reflects the continued expansion of telecommunications and digital services, as well as data-driven activities within the economy. The second largest contributor was the crops subsector, which contributed 19.8% to total GDP growth and recorded real GDP growth of 7.3%. This performance highlights the strong role of crop production in supporting growth in the agriculture sector. Within the industry sector, gold production was another major driver, contributing 16.6% to overall GDP growth, while recording real GDP growth rate of 19.6%. This underscores the importance of gold mining to Ghana's industrial output and export performance. Manufacturing also played a significant role, contributing 10.5% to the overall GDP growth of 6%, with a real GDP growth rate of 5.7% for manufacturing, reflecting ongoing activity in industrial production and value addition. Finally, transport and storage contributed 8.5% to the overall GDP growth, supported by real GDP growth of 8.6%, indicating increased movement of goods and services across the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, when I was defining the concept, I introduced GDP per capita. And if you recall, I had indicated that this is the gross domestic product shared among the population. So in other words, if you share the GDP among the people of the country, how much is each person getting? So Ghana's gross domestic product per capita, which is the GDP when shared with the population, increased from 35,834 Ghana cedis in 2024 to 42,501 Ghana cedis in 2025, representing a growth of 18.6% between the 2 years. In dollar terms, the GDP per capita increased by 33.9% from $2,527 in 2024 to $3,385 in 2025, partly on the back of the Asian rate appreciation we saw in 2025. This reflects improvement in national income per person. I must, however, emphasize that national averages do not necessarily reflect the income situation of every household. So even though that's the average, you'd have some households that would have higher than the average, and then some households would have lower than the average. Now, what are the key takeaways from our release of the 2025 quarter 4 GDP estimate, the December 2025 monthly indicator of economic growth, and the 2025 annual GDP estimates? Let's begin with the 2025 quarter 4 GDP estimates. The first takeaway is that stronger economic growth at the end of 2025 was witnessed. Ghana's economy grew by 5.8% in the fourth quarter of 2025, up from 4% in quarter 4 of 2024, indicating stronger year-on-year economic momentum toward the end of the year. Second, non-oil activities drove most of the expansion we saw in 2025. Non-oil GDP grew by 7.1% in quarter 4 of 2025, compared with 4.8% in quarter 4 of 2024, showing that growth was largely supported by sectors outside oil and gas. 3, agriculture sector recorded improved performance. The agriculture sector grew by 5.3% in quarter 4 of 2025, up from 3.2% in quarter 4 of 2024, mainly driven by crops, which expanded by 6.6%. Cocoa returned to positive growth of 3% after contracting by 12.8% in quarter 4 of 2024. 4, industry improved but remained constrained. Industry grew by 1.9% compared with 0.3% in quarter 4 of 2024. But performance was significantly affected by contraction in oil and gas production of 16.8%, despite positive growth in manufacturing at 6.1% and electricity at 7.2%. 5, services remained the main engine of growth in the fourth quarter of 2025. In fact, the services sector expanded by 8.6%, accounting for 50.6% of GDP and contributing 63.4% of overall economic growth. Now, let's look at the takeaways regarding the December 2025 monthly indicator of economic growth. Economic activity accelerated toward the end of the year. And here we see that economic activities as measured by the monthly indicator of economic growth expanded by 10.1% year on year in December 2025, with the index actually rising from 123.9 the index rising to 123.9 from 112.5 in December 2025. Also, growth in December was broad-based across the sectors. In fact, economic activity was led by services, which grew by 12.9%, followed by agriculture, 5.7%, and industry, 4.3%, indicating widespread improvement in economic activity. Now, turning to the 2025 annual GDP estimates. Our first takeaway there is that the services sector remained the largest contributor to economic activity. the services sector actually grew by 8.1% in 2025 and contributed 58.2% to total GDP growth, as well as accounted for the largest share of the economy at 45.9%. Second takeaway is that Ghana's economy remains service-led. In 2025, sectoral shares of GDP were services at 45.9%, industry at 31.3%, and agriculture at 22.8%. The third takeaway, ladies and gentlemen, is that digital and knowledge-based activities led sectoral expansion. In fact, the strongest expansion were in information and communication at 20%, education at 11.6%, transport and storage at 8.6%, and financial and insurance activities at 6.8%. And then fourth but not the least, a small number of sectors drove most of the growth. We saw information and communication, crops, gold, manufacturing, transport and storage, and education all together contributing some 87% to the total GDP growth of 6% in 2025, highlighting the main engines of economic expansion. With regards to per capita GDP, that's if you share the GDP among the population, Ghana's GDP per capita increased to 42,502 Ghana cedis in 2025, from 35,834 Ghana cedis in 2024, representing a growth of 18.6% between the 2 years. In dollar terms, the GDP per capita increased by 33.9%, from $2,527 US in 2024 to $3,385 US in 2025, partly on the back of the exchange rate appreciation witnessed in 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, based on these results, several practical recommendations emerge. For government, continued support for high-performing sectors such as agriculture, ICT, manufacturing, education, and logistics will help sustain economic momentum while addressing weaknesses in sectors such as oil and gas and other contracting activities. For businesses, opportunities remain strong in digital services, manufacturing, transport and logistics, education services, and agricultural value chains. And for households, careful spending, increased savings, and investment in skills can help build stronger financial resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, the Ghana Statistical Service remains committed to producing timely, accurate, relevant, and credible statistics to support national development. Our goal is to support evidence-based policy making, business planning, and national development through reliable and transparent data. Finally, we express our sincere appreciation to all ministries, departments, agencies, and businesses and institutions that provided data for the compilation of these statistics. We'd also like to express our sincere appreciation to the media, who is always with us to help us disseminate the information that we produce. We commend the dedicated staff of the Ghana Statistical Service, whose professionalism and hard work made this release possible. And we encourage all stakeholders to continue to support the production of official statistics for Ghana's development. Thank you very much. If you need further information about the GDP release, kindly contact Mr. Francis Bright Mensah, who is the Director for Economy at the Ghana Statistical Service. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lassa. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've done the presentation in English. We'll take the presentation in Twi so that Akan speaking this stage can also pose their question. So after that, we'll do it briefly. After that, we'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Francis. You, Adolfona, in your name, and pay Ghana Statistical Service, you share ya. Now, you share there, you have GDP home common. Now, obebe beside there about the GDP. GDP, ye, Zama Ghana produce whether so your goods or your services, so Nina, you take a bomb or country no more, and your friend GDP. The Ghana Statistical Service, quite a beer, aya, your measure, and yesusu, mesma GDP no, ote, whether Juma, Nkrofo ya, whether produce them goods and services, and whether them goods and services no roko nim, another or perform. Into on the friend economic performance. Now, Ejuma ye no from three different angles. Ye share Q4 of 2025, means my GDP no or performing. Ne ye share December 2025, also means my GDP no quite. Now, finally, you share the whole of 2025 on your friend annual GDP, honestly, you share means my GDP no quay. Now, yaba 2025 Q4 data you generated 2024 means my economy no okay. You the total GDP one. Not the economy no GDP performance okay nim. Now Q4 of 2025. Economy no nim by 5.8% in the fourth quarter of 2025. Now you had them 5.8% to 4% in 2024 Q4. No nature Q4 of 2025 ni GDP performance no or better than Q4 of 2024. Secondly, say ye oil and gas fee GDP ni mwa. Ye hunde economy no or growing by 7.1%. On oil ye friend non-oil GDP. In other words, economic activities nim by 7.1%. Until you compare last year Q4 2024 on na economy no nim by 4.8%. Into non-oil GDP 2025 Q4 no of 7.1%. No higher than 4.8 a year recorded Q4 of 2024. Now, Obe beside them GDP growth rate of 5.8% here recorded Q4 of 2025. What are the main drivers? And about sectors, na oma yenya them growth rate. Yemfa agriculture, agriculture nim by 5.3% in Q4 of 2025, up from 3.2% in Q4 of 2024. Now agriculture basically no for crops. Crops here in Zimana aya farmers would do there. Ono no call nim by 6.6%. Near who so there cocoa so call nim kakra. In fact, cocoa registered growth of 3% Q4 of 2025. Yet the compare last year 2024 Q4 na cocoa foam by 12.8%. See, you have your cocoa performance in Q4 of 2025 near the compare cocoa performance of Q4 of 2024. Cocoa performance no abanenim. And enyina kahoma agriculture nim by 5.3% in Q4. Nearby industries were union by 1.9% in Q4 of 2025. Yet the compare quarter 4 of 2024, on our industry, nearly by 0.3%. Until you see, 1.9%, on so now, or you higher, same 0.3%. But yes, your industry performance now. In fact, manufacturing, no electricity, we winning by 6.1% for manufacturing, now 7.2% for manufacturing. In the baby said, say manufacturing industry, we winning by 6.1%, no 7.2%. Abentina industry in a bar form by, by only 1.9%. Now answer no oil and gas. Oil and gas so is part of industry. Now oil and gas, production above form by in fact above form by 16.8%. In Tayina Kahoma industry, only by only 1.9% for in 2025 quarter 4. Now finally, you have services are. In fact, you have quarter 4. The sector now, Oma growth cost papa, yeah, services. Now services sector only by 8.6%. You have a services sector as well. Them GDP growth rate of 5.8% I account for quarter 4 of 2025. And services sector contributed by half of it. And a services sector as well in quarter 4 no. Yefa economy in fact, or constitute by 63 or contributed 63.4% to the overall growth. Now, 6 years, Yembra 2025 growth, that's the entire 2025 growth. Now, yeah, 2025 entire growth, no, 6.0%. Now, them 6.0% are recorded for 2025. The question is about sector. Now, or contribute to the 6.0% growth rate. Now, if you are services sector, now contributed the highest because services sector in by 8.1%. Now, or contribute 58.2% to the growth. Now, if you are still our services sector, on account for the biggest share of the economy. In fact, or account for about 46% of the economy. Now, say, yeah, apart from services sector, or account by 46%, industry so or account for 31%, in agriculture account for 23%. Now, services sector, yeah, nzama oko nenima, oma services sector no growth to mponpa ye. Digital and knowledge-based activities. Ahano yereka information and communication. Only nzama today mobile phone aya ringing aya yeyi. Another data yet to talk. Now education so cost so na transport and storage na financial services. Ohono growth no cost so pa when you na ka home mama services konenim. But yasha there are your subsectors via one performance, 2025 growth rate no call name pa. The them subsectors no include information and communication, crops, gold. You have gold to call name pa. Manufacturing, transport and storage, education. Them nzamaya mabuboy 5 ningina will contribute by 87% to the total growth of 6% in 2025. Now, Obibeka de say aye in area about recommendation. Na yedere ma households, na businesses, na government. And for household, ye chere the main masses ya growth on all koneni man economy all growing all koneni man. Or there household timi ye nzame bia obma won sika semu ayezen. Na nzama obetimi aye no ono include what spend I won't spend carefully. Now, what make sure so that I will be saving kakra. Now, I soon say, what pede, what you may be the major one or Obama papa. No, one share a juma, no growth, no quenim pa. Like, I want them the information and communication, reconim. Now, transport and storage reconim to them businesses and households, or pede way you may be no work, them businesses no more. obetima aboa won papa. Now businesses so Erika there CCLR growth no work on enemy. Businesses when invest na aya when you scale one business more one expand one buebue we adwuma nim nya da obe disca no but one buebue adwuma nim na adwuma no still on grow fast. Especially you have information and communication sector, transport and storage, manufacturing, agriculture value chains, education, na financial services. They who they hono nzamaru kondenim pa anti them sectors no ye pede ye hu more investment and ye pede ye hu more expansion what them sectors nim. But at the same time so you'll advise there FEMSA and njuma ya waye all them sectors here and other sectors no go make sure there ska kakra wa wona resources kakra wa wono what the bay adwuma na when you more output and we may produce more goods and services. Now abanso yerika there abanso wo da obetima ye da boa ma growth no yenya growth of 6% yenya 2025 no going forward them growth no either you be maintain and I be more akosoro more. Now yes abanso or make sure there sectors are what perform ye papa pan today bia information and communication sector, market manufacturing, transport and logistics, education, financial services. Aban board them sectors no na still won kwenim. Now me can so there sectors wo issues kakra wo like oil and gas. Ono so there aban boy neni na ordinary kodo. Na you hwe maye be ya ye be address issues ho na ye team aboa one ma one so one production akosoro. Ma wetin ma affect my GDP no wa basoro. Until ladies and gentlemen, me da wana sepa antasema ye de break Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you, GS, for the presentation. So now we want to open the floor. If you have any question, please raise your hand so that we'll give you the mic to pose your question on what has been presented, the quarter four.
Thank you very much, Doc, for the very seasoned and in-depth presentation. We wish to ask, how would you summarize for us in terms of what drove the growth in Q4? And would love to know if we have the data for Q3 cocoa sector growth. Thank you.
Okay, let me take some more questions and then we can, Who's that? What's happening? Online, okay. So Francis, let's alert the online team to watch. Yeah. Or we can mute them, right? Yeah. So let's take some more questions and then we can respond
Do you
to
have
them.
any question online? Okay. Yes, I think we can answer this.
Okay, we've exhausted all the questions?
Yeah, because we shared the...
It would have been surprising if we didn't hear from Echo, you know.
Thank you, Doc. My name is Echo from Bloomberg. Doc, on this one, on the bottom 5, those contracting subsectors, we have known that food inflation has been quite positive, has been coming down, and it's around its lowest in a while. So to have had accommodation and food services shrink or contract by 4.5%, begs the question, how do you disaggregate that from how food itself is doing versus what we have as food and inflation and accommodation? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, is there any other? All right. Could you please, Francis, show the table, the 3 tables? Expanding, contracting, and Okay. No, for the year, the annual. Yeah, down. Yes, please go down. Yeah. Yes, the drivers. Go down, down. Yeah. Down. Just go. Yes. Okay, so your first question, how would you summarize what drove the growth? Okay. I want to tackle it from first let me give an explanation of, I'll make a clarification and then I'll answer your question directly. The first one is that usually, and please let's take note, when we say what is driving growth, and that's the question, what drove the growth? You see, on the face of it, if you're not careful, you answer the question by going for the sectors that expanded the most, or the sectors that gave you the highest growth rates. But that doesn't respond to that question. The drivers of growth, or what drove growth the most, are the activities whose growth and weight impact contributed the most to what? To growth. So if I should answer your question, what drove growth the most in 2025? It's number 1, information and communication. Number 2, crops. Number 3, gold. Number 4, manufacturing. And number 5, transport and storage. And information and communication contributed 23.7% to overall growth of 6% in 2025. Crops contributed 19.8% to the overall growth of 6% in 2025. Gold contributed 16.6% to the overall growth. Manufacturing contributed 10.5% to the overall growth. And transport and storage contributed 8.5%. Exactly, to the overall growth. So that's how I would answer your question. But I had mentioned that if you're looking at the top 5 expanding sectors, that would be communication and information, which is still one of the top 5 drivers. That would also be what? Education. But you realize that education, though grew by 11.6%, did not feature in the top 5 drivers because it has a smaller weight. Right. And then you see fishing. It's actually also grew by 9.5%. But this contribution is what? Very small. In fact, the contribution is 1.7% because it has a smaller weight. But we've seen transport and storage, which expanded by 8.6%, which is very high, but it made its way on the list of the top 5 drivers because it has a bigger weight. And so it contributed 8.5% to growth. And then you have financial and insurance activities, which actually grew by 6.8%. Again, another high expanding activity, but it didn't make its way to the top 5 drivers because it has a what? A smaller weight. So that's how I would like to answer your question. And then you ask a question about the bottom 5. So your question was, I think basically that was the quarter, accommodation and food services. So your question was, if we've seen inflation come down, and also when we reported inflation of 3.3%, for February, I think one of the points we made was that part of the reduction we've seen in inflation is because we've seen drastic reduction in food prices. Exactly. So the question ECHO is asking is that one of the subsectors that contracted in quarter 4, and take note, is quarter 4 of 2025, was accommodation and food services. And how come we have that? A number of reasons could be attributed to that. First of all, I need to bring in a caveat that the Statistical Service collects the data, will tell you what the real values are, right? And then we make a comparison, and then there's a contraction, and we report the way it is. Now, to actually be able to tell the causes of this contraction, you need to do an additional analysis, which we haven't done. So we will not be able to empirically tell you that the negative growth rate we are seeing in accommodation and food services is because of this factor by this much and all that, because the disaggregation may not be readily available. Unless we have disaggregation of, Francis, if you could check, if you have disaggregation of accommodation and food services in our data, then to that extent, we should be able to tell you, yes, the disaggregation. Now, having said that, if you take accommodation, for example, let's take hotel accommodation. We know a lot of the hotels bill in what? US, right? US dollars. But then, of course, let me not say they bill in US dollars. They have dollars, but then there's a cedi equivalent of what? The US dollars. So if you are in a regime where you see a lot of cedi appreciation, right? And then you have hotels billing in cedis, but the cedi equivalent of US dollars is likely to affect the bottom line, especially if they don't reduce the prices, or if they don't do anything about the prices. If they don't do anything about the price, they just convert straight to cedis. So that will lead to reduction in price, and that can affect the bottom line. And when the bottom line is affected, it can affect the production. So that's one such reason we could ascribe. Again, food is very small. Food has a very small weight in accommodation and food services, very small weight. So even though in the inflation side, you may see food inflation coming down. Again, we also saw that, in fact, food inflation was still positive, but it is coming down. But because of the relatively small weight, the inflation impact may not be that much here. Thank you very much. Is there any other?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, well,
Yeah.
you want to come back?
Yeah,
Okay, the last question.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
Doc, thank you. I still want to focus on Q4. I don't quite remember where I saw the performance of gold in just the quarter.
Yes.
So maybe the performance of gold in just Q4, not the full year,
Okay.
would help. And also by that narration, you said, is it accommodation and food services? Now, is that synonymous to hotels and water views?
Yes. It's all part of It's all
Okay.
part of it.
Because you sounded like that, it was a bit here and there.
Okay. Yes.
Crops, gold, manufacturing are the drivers for the 2025 annual. I just wanted to clarify.
Yes, please. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So, Eko, I think your other question is on gold. Yes.
Oh,
On,
yeah.
I think it was on oil. On gold, eh?
On gold.
On gold. Yes. Yeah. So, Francis, could you check? They want the Q4 of gold. So we'll check and then we'll let you know. Yeah, the growth rate of gold in Q4 of 2025. We'll let you know. Yeah.
And also,
Yeah.
I have an observation.
Yeah.
In the fourth quarter,
Yeah.
I know that we are likely to have a lot of visitors who come in from abroad to come and spend what some call Dirty December. They have different names for it.
Okay.
We have a lot of activities in that season.
Yeah.
So I find it quite intriguing that in the fourth quarter of all quarters, accommodation and food services rather should shrink, because that is where we get the influx of many people who come in for Christmas holidays and water views, parties and water views. So a bit more of disaggregation there
Okay.
would diffuse my mind. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'll ask my technical team to throw some more color on accommodation and food services. But let's take some more questions if you have them. Okay. So we need if you have the data on gold for Q4 2025. But otherwise, if it's not readily available, we can make them available to you, shortly. And then accommodation and food services. Francis, if we have further disaggregation, we can zero down on that. But otherwise, we can also, like I said, I gave a generic answer, which is to say that we collect the data at that disaggregated level. So once we don't have a further disaggregation in our data, we will not be able to, anything we say would be hazarding guesses, which is not very appropriate. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So, Eko, we'll give you the good. He's looking for it, so when we close, we'll give you the good figure. So we thank you for your presence. The index of industrial production will be uploaded onto our website, so you can look out for that. On that note, let's have a wonderful day.
When is
CPI is first week.
First week of next month.
First Wednesday of the month. April.
Yeah.
April 2nd.
April 2nd?
First April. But that's a holiday, so.
So let's take
we'll
it.
keep you updated. Yeah.
We'll announce to you the date for the next CPI release. Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Okay.
You now want to wipe your face.
Sorry, my name is Jerry from Jones. I wanted a bit of clarification. So the fourth quarter is 5.8, and the overall for 2025 is 6%.
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
I scared so. I say,
Charlie. Why is you? If I want the man. I better make.
I didn't hear so. I didn't
Yeah.